Today we're going to make a coffee table with a concrete top. I'm going to start by making the base for the table. I had a leftover piece of 2x10 and I just cut two short pieces that were the same length. I'll put dimension drawings for this project on my website. I then cut some pieces of 2x4 to length. I want to cut recesses in the 2x10 pieces that will allow the 2x4s to fit in them. I'm going to do this by drilling holes in the corners and then cutting between the holes with my jigsaw. I then sanded all the pieces of wood with an orbital sander. We stained the pieces of wood prior to assembling because we thought it'd be easier to get into all the nooks and crannies. But it turned out we had to make some design changes, so we probably should have waited till the end before staining. I used a ruler when assembling the base to make sure both sides were even. I used 2.5 and 3-inch long finish screws to screw the pieces together. I was a little concerned about putting a heavy concrete top on this base, so I added some extra pieces of 2x4s to the design. I then used wood putty to cover up the screws before sanding down the wood putty and applying a second coat of stain over the top, which hid all the putty and screws. I used my table saw to rip down 3.5-inch wide strips of melamine to use as the sides for the concrete mold. I used some scraps of thin plywood to make a template for the concrete countertop. I then used this template to get the measurements for cross-cutting the strips of melamine. I then used my hot glue gun to glue the melamine mold together around the template that I made. I used some scrap pieces of 2x4 as supports around the outside. I used hot glue around the outside of the mold, and then I sealed the inside of the mold with silicone. I glued and screwed 2 layers of 3/4-inch plywood together to make a plywood core for the concrete countertop. This plywood core will increase the strength and reduce the weight of this top. I coated the plywood with 2 coats of minwax polyacrylic. It's important to seal the plywood so it doesn't steal moisture away from the wet concrete. I used wire cutters to cut a piece of reinforcing mesh. I then used screws and some thin wire to suspend the mesh about 1/2 inch from the surface of the plywood. I want the plywood core to be flush to the top surface of the mold, so I made some quick plywood spacers and screwed them to the plywood core. I made the plywood core so that it fits inside the mold with 1.5 inches of space around it. I'm going to use 2 bags of Quikrete 5000 to make this concrete top. I filled the mold about 3/4 of the way full before placing the plywood core. It's really important to try to push all the wet concrete down into the corners of the mold. The plywood is lighter than the concrete, so it wants to float up a little bit, so I used some weights to hold it down flush to the surface. I used an orbital sander without a sanding pad to vibrate some of the air bubbles out of the concrete. I let the concrete cure 4 full days before removing the mold and placing it on the wood base. I then placed the concrete top onto the wood base. Now I could screw through the 2x4 on the underside and into the plywood, but the top is heavy enough and it's not going to slide anywhere. For more detailed instructions, check out my website, and if you want to see what I'm working on next, be sure to follow me on Instagram. Also, check out some of our other videos, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And check out Ryobi Nation to see other DIY projects and a chance to win the tools that I use. If you want to learn more about the concrete products that I use, check out quikrete.com.